could knock this house down with your shoulder. You could roll it up and carry it on your back. It had no foundation, no stone, no nails, no mortar. And it stood through winter so violent they killed grown men sheltering behind walls 3 feet thick. Everywhere else in the world, people fought the cold the same way. By building heavier, denser, more permanent, thick stone, deep foundations, roofs weighed down against the wind. The nations of the Great Plains did the exact opposite. They built something light enough to lift, and it outlasted the storms that flattened everything heavier. The first Europeans who saw it saw a flimsy tent and decided no one could possibly survive out here. They were wrong, and they were wrong for a simple reason. They were looking for a wall. This was never a wall. It was a strategy, because the teepee was never really the answer. The Plains winter threw many different weapons at these families, and they had a counter for each one, except a single enemy. Against that one, they never built a defense at all. They simply moved. And to understand how a house learns to run, you have to start with the one law that governed everything inside it. Wait. Long before horses ever reached these plains, an entire household had to fit onto a travois. 2 long poles lashed into a simple frame and dragged by a dog. No wheels, no wagons, nothing but muscle and the animals that walked beside these families. So every single thing they owned had to answer one question before anything else. Can it be carried? Lightness wasn't a matter of taste, it was law. And because the house itself was so light, the ground it stood on had to do the work that heavy walls do for the rest of us. That's why the placing of a lodge was never careless. A tree line, the low bank of a river, the sunlit face of a south-facing slope, a stand of timber close enough to feed the fire. Each was chosen to shield a shelter that could not shield itself by mass alone. But every advantage carried a hidden price. A deep valley blocked the wind, and then pooled with heavy freezing air after dark. A sheltering cliff could send down snow or stone in the night. So they never searched for the perfect ground. They searched for the ground with the fewest mistakes in it. What rose on that ground was quietly ingenious. The cone let wind slide around it instead of striking it flat. Let heavy snow slip off before its weight turned dangerous, and let lodgepole pine bend in the worst gusts rather than break. But look closer, and it isn't a perfect cone at all. It leans, steeper at the back, its peak tilted forward, deliberately lopsided. To modern eyes, it looks careless. In reality, it's aerodynamics, carved by hand and corrected by every winter that ever tried to flatten it. And still, the thing keeping that family alive was not the hide you could see. The strongest part of the whole house was an empty space no outsider could ever notice. That empty space was a second skin, a liner hung from the poles, running around the inside wall from the ground, up to about shoulder height. And the secret was never a thicker material. It was the gap. Cold air slipping in at the base didn't cross the floor where people slept. The liner caught it and lifted it up into the narrow channel between the 2 hides, where it climbed, curled over, and came back down toward the fire that needed it. They didn't insulate with more. They insulated with less, with a pocket of trapped, empty air. The strongest wall in that house was the part that wasn't there. The hides themselves helped, of course. Winter buffalo hide carried a dense coat of fur, and inside that fur sat millions of tiny, motionless air pockets. The very same principle behind every insulated wall built today. But out on open grassland, there were no forests, and so the thing that kept the fire alive through the night was not wood at all. It was bison chips, dried buffalo dung, which burns hot, burns steady, and burns almost without smoke. The most useless-looking thing on the prairie turned out to be the perfect fuel for a house that could not afford smoke. Even the storm was put to work, since snow banking up against the base sealed the last gaps where wind could sneak in. The fire stayed small in its shallow pit, and two flaps at the very top opened and closed like a living chimney. But those flaps were tied to two long poles planted outside in the open, which means the entire house was steered from the outside. Its vents turned to meet the wind like the sails of a ship. And if the wind shifted while everyone slept and no one went out to turn them, the smoke came down instead of up, and a sleeping family would not wake, which meant someone had to go out into 40 below in the middle of the storm. So when wind turned in the dead of night, someone rose from the warmest place they had, pushed out through the flap, and stepped into 40 below with bare hands to move those two poles and set the vents right again, then came back in. Not a hero, a duty taken in turns, expected of everyone. And this is exactly where sweat became a killer. To go out and work too hard, or to push yourself too far hauling wood before sunset, was to sign a quiet sentence, because damp clothing pulls the warmth out of a body many times faster than dry, still air ever could. So the unwritten law of the plains was strange but exact. Warmth you earn by sweating is warmth you pay back with your life. Move slow, come home cold, and once you were back inside, the ground itself was still trying to take your heat, so the floor was built in layers as careful as the walls. First, woven mats of willow or reed to lift everything off the frozen earth. Then, thick dried grass to hold still air the way the fur did. Then, heavy robes laid fur side up, soft surface catching body heat, while the tough hide beneath stopped every draft from below. On the coldest nights, smooth river stones were heated at the fire's edge, wrapped in hide, and slipped beneath the sleeping places to give their warmth back slowly for hours. Families slept close, soft tanned skins worn inside, buffalo robes over the top, moccasins lined with dry grass. And notice something in all of it. Not one part of the buffalo was ever wasted. Hide became wall, fur became insulation, sinew became thread, bone became tools, horn became spoons, dung became fire, and the meat became the very warmth glowing inside those sleeping bodies. One animal was an entire civilization, and they never called this surviving off the land. They had another word for it, one that changes everything about how we should see this house. For many nations of the plains, the bond with the land and with the buffalo was never conquest, and it was never quite what we mean by survival either. It was closer to being kept, a relationship that ran both ways, taking only what was needed and returning respect for it. We say they survived the winter. They would have said the land let them stay. And staying took a kind of knowledge no wall could hold. A person had to read the shape of a cloud, the turn of the wind, the restlessness moving through a bison herd, the flight of birds, and know what was coming before it came. To know which fuel burned hottest, and to know when it was wiser to move the whole camp than to stand and take the storm. Because that was the one enemy they never tried to fight. Against the worst blizzards, the strategy was never a thicker wall. It was to be gone before it arrived. In under an hour, the entire village could roll itself up, load onto the travois, and vanish from the storm's path. The strongest wall on the plains was the one that knew when to leave. They didn't outbuild the storm, they outran it. The dogs listened while the people slept, and the lodges stood in a circle so every family could watch over every other. By dawn, the storm had passed. The snow lay deep, and the lodge still stood. Light, fragile looking, completely completely unharmed. That was not a miracle. It was not luck. And it was certainly not primitive. We built heavier to keep the world out. They built lighter to stay part of it. And only one of those houses could get up and walk away from the storm. If this is the kind of history you want more of, stay with us. Because the things we've forgotten are usually the things we needed most.